start showing up. But welcome, everybody. It's a delightful day for us to announce the formal partnership that Global Governance Advisors has structured this past year with the Globe and Mail after GGA had spent 9 years providing CEO compensation data to the Globe and Mail around the top 100 annual study headed by Janet McFarlane, and more recently with David Milstead. It was a pleasure and a joy that as Tony Spazzeri joined our firm this past year, that so too did the board games research that our team had been able to study and work with the Globe and Mail. And today we've assembled an incredible panel for you of boardroom experts in leadership, companies from Morrow Sodali, Bennett Jones, Audrey Bernstein, and of course, we are joined by the lead author of the board games research this year, David Milstead. This couldn't have been made possible without a sincere thank you and gratitude to our partners at the Globe and Mail, Janet McFarlane, David Milstead, and of course, Gary Saleswitz as well. We're so delighted, and this couldn't have been made possible by the unbelievable Herculean task that Tony Spazzeri and our analyst team have pulled off this year. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Tony. For any specific questions today that might fall out of the discussion, please visit ggainc.com. That's ggainc.com. You can reach myself, Tony Spazzeri, or any one of our partners, and we'd be happy to help you through any corporate governance, executive compensation, board advisory services, or of course, anything else related to any other inquiries that you might have. Tony, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Just one second here. Thank you very much, Paul. I really appreciate that. I'm excited to have joined Global Governance Advisors in 2022. I made the decision to transition my career into a board advisory capacity, now applying my knowledge to assist boards to assist with board solutions more directly. I'm continuing to work in an area that I'm passionate about, advising boards on compensation, corporate governance, and proxy disclosure. And now I'm also able to continue to research corporate governance as I continue to lead the research behind the Globe and Mail's board games publication. For those of you who don't know about board games, it's a rating system that has been published in the Globe and Mail since 2001 that assesses the corporate governance practices of S&P TSX Composite Index companies. And now GGA provides the data to support it by reviewing the management information circulars of each one of those companies. Your proxy is a key shareholder communication item. It's an important opportunity for you to tell your story and to provide your shareholders with the information they'll need to make their voting decisions. And over the years, probably in part due to board games, the proxy has become a significantly easier document to read and provides greater insight to the shareholders on board practice and executive compensation. While I may not agree necessarily with all board games measures philosophically, board games like guidelines published by shareholder advisory firms and institutional shareholders does exist as a means for providing a corporate governance framework to shareholders for them to consider as an investment tool. The Globe and Mail, however, takes the board games framework and scores companies to shine a light on the corporate governance measures adopted by these large companies in Canada, as opposed to simply publishing board games as a list of good governance guidelines. What is important for organizations or boards specifically to know and understand are the levels of influence and pressure from the different shareholders and stakeholder expectations. This understanding is helpful for fundamentally deciding what's important and what makes sense for your company specifically. Good governance is largely dependent on many different factors, including corporate complexity, ownership, and a combination of external pressures as well. A younger company in the capital markets or small cap isn't realistically expected to be at the same governance standard by measurement in board games as, say, a Royal Bank or a Finning. Yet, This is what a framework like board games may communicate, but it's just not that simple. Now, it's one of the responsibilities of the board to ensure that it is accountable for its own performance. It does govern itself, and it is best to monitor the various corporate governance and good board practices that exist. And lately, with the focus on the broader ESG agenda and determining what's right and what can and should be regulated and what frameworks to use, it may feel a bit like drinking from a fire hose as of late. Today, we're here to discuss what is the lay of the land in 2022 and moving into 2023. Now, this webinar is effectively split into two distinct parts. The first part will be focusing on the Globe and Mail's board games publication in a discussion with David Milstead. And in the second part, we'll go beyond board games and meet with our panelists to discuss what they see in their work, about what's on the mind of boards and how they're navigating today's business climate and what that may look like in 2023. Now, before we jump into the first part of the webinar, I'd like to introduce you to all of our great panelists. Dexter John is here, CEO of Morrow Sodali Canada. Prior to Morrow Sodali's acquisition of Griffin Advisors, Dexter was president and CEO of Griffin, where he was responsible for the North American business and led a team of experienced governance and financial professionals. Elaine Roper, partner and head board and CHRO practices at Odgers Berndtson, is here with us today. Her expertise lies in corporate and board governance, human capital strategy planning and implementation, and executive talent management and search. Michael Mellinson, partner at Bennett Jones LLP, is here practicing. He practices extensively in the capital markets area with an emphasis on public and private offerings of securities, takeover bids, and mergers and acquisitions. And he acts for clients in a wide range of industries, particularly in the mining industry. Emma Purdy, partner at Global Governance Advisors and a colleague of mine. Emma's expertise in management consulting focused on advising global organizations on how to integrate and align large-scale business and digital transformations with risk management, tax, and regulatory requirements and compliance practices. Her experience includes ESG benchmarking and rating analytics, international tax structuring, tax risk management, and cyber risk mitigation strategies. And last but not least, David Milstead, a reporter for the Globe and Mail, business journalist since 1994, who joined the Globe and Mail in 2009, and as has already been mentioned, leads the Board Games annual publication. So the first part, David, just one second, I'm going to spotlight you here. David, thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to be joined by you, good friend. I'm really looking forward to this new chapter with the new partnership between the Globe and Mail and Global Governance Advisors. Board Games has long been a project of significance for me. The work allowed me to have a finger on the pulse of how boards and proxy disclosure have evolved in Canada. I've also had the absolute pleasure of communicating with many of you here today on corporate governance matters as they align with the Board Games methodology and also much more than that. Now, over the last 21 years or so, corporate governance and disclosure have evolved. The proxies have significantly evolved, and it seems we're perhaps moving into yet another era of significant changes with the focus on environment and social matters. So David, we've worked now together for about 3 to 4 years, and I'm appreciative of the countless discussions we've had about the evolution of corporate governance and specifically proxy disclosure. So you lead Board Games today. Can you give us insight into its history and its purpose and what you're looking to achieve moving forward as it evolves with the times?
Yeah, absolutely. Tony, thanks for having me here. Thanks to GGA for having me here, and thanks to GGA for taking on this project. Our partnership with the Johnson Center at Rotman lasted 20 years, and it came time for them to go in a different direction, shall we say. And so we, as we looked to Board Games in 2022, we had, we were concerned that we would not be able to pull off something that of the nature that we've been doing for a number of years. And it was fortuitous that Tony, who probably has more hardcore board games experience than anyone else in Canada, was in this new opportunity with GGA, who we already had an established relationship with, and it worked out very well. That said, we also, realized that this was an opportunity for a bit of a refresh. At the conclusion of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about what's next, but I think people are very interested in what we've done for this year, because there were a fair number of changes, more than in any recent year that I recall. And scores changed, I think, a fair amount for a number of companies. So, we recognized that we were moving from a situation where an academic institution with graduate students was doing the work to a situation with Tony and GGA being in the private sector. And it was a great opportunity to say, do we need all of these questions? Do we need to calculate them or score them the same ways? And it really accelerated some talk we'd been having about particular questions. One of the things that we talked about a lot was, we had a lot of questions where 90%, 95% of the companies were getting full points on them. And so you can argue this either way. You can argue and say, well, that question, which was innovative and leading edge in the early days of board games, has now become nearly a universal standard. So should that be part of board games anymore, when the intent of board games is to be leading edge? The flip side of that argument, which I actually had a great deal of sympathy for, is some of these are so foundational to governance now, and yet it's not 100%, it's 95%, 90%. Shouldn't you absolutely punish, for lack of a better word, the companies that are still not doing that? In the end, I think the first view won out, and a number of the questions that we excised or revised were ones where there was an awful lot of full credit being received by the companies. So I have a PowerPoint here. It's very gray. There's not a lot of color. There's not a lot of animation, but I've seen the registration list. I know most of you are general counsels or corporate secretaries, so I know you can handle it. I've read your work. Now you can read mine. So I'm going to take you through a tour of some of the major changes. It's entirely possible that I forgot something or missed something, and I'm happy to be reminded. But we can start here, and this is a good example of one of the questions that we felt, there was very high positives. And actually, if you look on the left side in my slides, there are some percentages next to the original question. Those are the percentages of companies getting full credit, then partial credit, then no credit. So you see in this question about board independence, only 1% of companies in board games in 2021 failed to get any points for this. And so what we did was we feel board independence is still important, but rather than having GGA go through the exercise of examining every committee in addition to the board, particularly the audit committees, for which there are regulatory requirements about independence, we struck the committee level questions that totaled 3 points and added those points to the overall question about the percentage of the company's board being fully independent. So board independence still counts for 7 points in a way, but we shifted the emphasis from the committee structure to the overall board level. And I should add that Tony is the one who marks all this. Tony, if you think that I'm failing to adequately explain something or I'm missing something about the motivation, please feel free to try to interrupt me. So, sure. Good. Okay. Lead independent director. This is probably one of the. There's a lot of changes this year, but this actually may be one of the more important philosophical changes.
Has been asked for, actually, it seems, for a little while as well.
Oh, yes, I have actually had a one-on-one meeting with a company who felt very strongly about this. And I think, in the previous iteration of board games, when the concept of the lead independent director was introduced, I think the philosophy at the Globe and for board games was sort of a half-hearted measure. And I think we still believe that is not nearly as good as true independence. But I think where we shifted on this is our belief that, again, getting to the companies that aren't making any kind of attempt to have even a lead independent director when they have a non-independent chairman, we felt that we needed to draw a line to give them less credit than a company that's at least putting a lead independent director on there. So this in the green you see for 2022 is that you do now get a point on top of your normal scoring for the lead independent director. It's still not a huge it's not a huge amount of points, and you clearly get far more credit for having a fully independent chair who is not the CEO. But we are in a position now where you don't get 0 if you actually go and designate a lead independent director. Very minor change, couple minor changes here. Then this may evolve in the future. You can see that we have 89% getting full credit for avoiding board overlap. I think board overlap is still an issue that we are concerned with, and we may very well be addressing it in a couple weeks when Board Games is published. But for now, we have struck that first question about overlap and substituted a question that's more focused on the CEO sitting on boards, because we recognize the trend towards, if you will, professional directors, retired CPAs, retired executives, whatever their past, who now have found have found serving as a corporate director to be a way to continue, to continue to be in the corporate world, and we recognize that within the ISS and Glass-Lewis limits for overboarding, that those folks exist. I think we've become more concerned with the very taxing job of the CEO and whether they're further spreading themselves thin by sitting on public company boards. And as you can see here, a minor change on the directors. We previously delineated composite company boards. It struck me that didn't make any sense. I mean, there's nothing more. It's not that a TSX composite board is more challenging than a NASDAQ or NYSE board. So we just changed that to public company to make that a little bit clearer that serving on a board is the issue, not what country it's in.
And what I will say, especially specifically to the CEO, is there are many companies that will have a policy that doesn't allow for the CEO to fit on more than a very limited number of boards, and a lot of times that is just one outside board. And so we're really seeing the practice showing up in the question here.
All right, so now we move into the diversity questions, and you'll see a real increased emphasis here. We bumped up on the gender diversity. We kept the language essentially the same, but we bumped up the point level for the full credit. So the more than 33% of directors are women is now 4 marks. And then if you're in that 25 to 33 range, you're still at 2. So it bumped up the point values for the companies that we deem to be at the sort of upper bound range of gender diversity on a board.
Right, and the biggest change, I would say personally, especially having seen the scores and how the companies have scored, is really in the non-gender diversity shift.
Mm-hmm. And this one is a little bit more of a complex change. We introduced the non-gender diversity question a couple years ago, and it was I think a mildly aggressive choice, because what we chose to do was take the language of the CBC, Canada Business Corporations Act, and apply it to all the companies in board games, whether they were federally incorporated companies or not. And we discussed that a lot. And one of the questions was, do you really want to make a law apply to companies that the law doesn't apply to? And my answer was, board games is aspirational. And if it's good enough for the federal government for a law For some companies, then we can make it apply to all companies. It's board games. We get to make that decision. So we introduced that a couple years ago, and that was an area where companies really, I mean, a very few companies got full credit when we first introduced that. And this year we have raised the bar quite a bit. And the new language is a hybrid of actual gender diversity and disclosure. And one of the things we felt was that it is very helpful to shareholders to actually say which of the groups you have representation from. So the maximum award is having more than one board member who is part of a diverse group, and you make clear which groups they represent. And then you descend to combinations of fewer diverse directors and less disclosure, all the way on down, to a potential 0 points. And then we also increased the point value for addressing the issue of diversity and the process by which you go about it. But you can see there, this was 2 points worth of questions last year. It's now 6 points worth. It's a big leap. Okay, so a lot of these other changes are small, but they do add up. But we kept board games at 100 points while narrowing the number of questions. So there really was a lot of reallocation. We bumped up the point for companies that have independent directors meeting without management at every board meeting. We felt that that was of great value, so we added a point to those that do it at every meeting and kept the other values the same. If the independent directors meet at regular board meetings, but not all, that's still at 2 points. Tony?
So David, can we maybe, we'll show all of the changes as much as we can, but maybe let's focus a bit more on where maybe there were more significant changes, like the director age and retirement policy, for instance.
Sure.
This is much more specific.
Okay. Yes, our next one. So we also the previous language on this, you actually could get a point simply for disclosure, and if you disclosed you had no retirement age policy, you still got the point. And we made a decision that it actually is good to have a director retirement policy, and that so we changed the value and the nature of the question to 2 points for having the policy and being clear about what that policy is. And now you can, if you disclose that you have no policy, you get 0 points instead of 1. Okay. We scratched, and there are several slides along this nature. One of the things that we did in our discussions with GGA is we moved away from board games questions where we essentially were recalculating stock ownership based on our criteria and asking GGA to do an extensive amount of data extraction and math and coming up with the sort of board games approved level of stock ownership in potential contrast to what the companies were disclosing. So the questions where we tried to redefine ownership and how we were counting it were struck. And instead, we sort of embedded some of those value judgments in the disclosure rules and saying, and saying what kind of disclosure we expected to see in arriving at the number. And so a lot of those value judgments about what the board games considers a legitimate stock holding have been sort of recrafted into the disclosure rules. And it might be argued that that they are more lenient that way, but I think in experience, Tony, I think it probably is shaking out very similarly.
So ultimately, before there was a measure that looked at whether or not directors and executives were meeting their guidelines, specifically to what board games benchmark. And that was also one where if a company maybe scored very low, it was largely because they were using different equity that didn't meet the requirements of the board games question. And that's effectively now embedded in the ownership policy scrutiny is, does the ownership policy only allow for those specific types of equity and shares in determining instead of actually determining what the ownership level is? So it's a much higher scrutiny on the policy as opposed to the behavior, because ultimately the behavior is that directors and executives do hold their share according to their requirements.
Yeah, and we decided it was a much more efficient way to go about it by looking at the policy rather than trying to recalculate, because we felt there really aren't too many companies out there that are acknowledging that there's a wholesale non-compliance with their ownership policy. Similarly, more things about how we calculate things. We did up the requirements for CEO ownership. We increased the points, but we also increased the threshold to get the maximum points. So if CEOs were about at the same level they were in the past, their point value probably didn't change, but there is sort of a new higher point award for CEOs with a greater amount of share ownership. And then similarly, we also boosted and made a little bit more rigorous the requirements for the other named executive officers.
Right.
And again, this is another example of cutting a rule that was where we recalculate things ourselves. Really quickly, we got rid of the anti-hedging policy question, which seemed to be a relic of about 15 or 20 years ago. We increased the credit for putting performance hurdles on stock options or share units, and also on the question of if there could be no payout on the stock awards. Those went from 1 to 2 in each case. We also increased some of the reward for small dilution, but at the same time made that definition of small dilution tougher to achieve. So if you actually have dilution of less than 3%, you get 3 points, whereas previously you got 2 points for being less than 5%. And if your dilution was exactly the same as last year, and it was in the 3 to 5% range, you still got 2 marks. So there wasn't a change there, but you did not get maximum points. We removed this burn rate question about whether it's disclosed, and just stayed with the more value-based ones about what we considered to be good levels of those. This one of the reasons that I like public speaking, and some people fear when I do it, is how I actually tell the truth about things. This green line I will call the Rogers rule, because as we were preparing board games last year, I went to Janet McFarland. I said, and this, of course, was at the time of the issues with the Rogers board. And I went to Janet McFarland. I said, our economic ratio requirements give Rogers credit for, they don't get 0 points. They get points in this, even though the common shareholders have no votes. And Janet's reaction was, well, that's not really what we intended with that. And so we added to the economic ratio material and said flat out that if you offer your subordinate shareholders 0 votes for board director elections, you're going to get 0 marks regardless of the vote to equity ratio. And that was absolutely a direct result of analyzing the Rogers situation last year. So Tony, you wanted to find a comment?
Yeah, so I apologize. We're just running a bit long.
Okay, I'm almost, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll wrap it up. One extra point for a say on pay vote. We think the stragglers on that need to be penalized more. We got rid of a couple of old disclosure issues. We got rid of the board attendance one because we were getting 97% full credit on board attendance. So those are my contact information. You can always, on the Globe website, you can always click on my picture. You can get to me that way if you have any questions. We have a board games email at the Globe and Mail now, and there's also a dedicated board games email at GGA. So I'm happy to take questions at this time if we have time for that.
Yeah, if anyone has any specific questions right now for this first part for David and on board games, or for myself, we're happy to take a few right now.
And if you have time, if you need time to process all that and the question occurs to you later in the session, if there is time, once the panel is taking their questions, I might be able to field something. But if there's any specific questions about this year's board games criteria. Oh, and Tony, I did promise a little bit of forward-looking material. I'll say very briefly that we have discussed at great length the fact that climate is not part of board games. We obviously think that is a hugely emerging point of governance. We have been we've realized that there have been a lot of different standards for climate reporting in the last couple of years. The Globe did a large story a couple of years ago on the lack of a standard. I think that within the next couple of years, there's a good chance that climate will be integrated into board games. However, board games wants to be leading edge and not bleeding edge. And I think that we thought that it would be very difficult to write a series of questions and standards that could apply equally across the composite and at this time in 2022. But I think that that's where we're going to be going. And as the disclosures evolve and get more robust, we'll be able to develop questions that are fair.
Yes, and I know I've with the team, I have been tasked with, coming up with examples of what might be possible to measure, because like you just said, David, it's leading edge, not bleeding edge. So what seems appropriate to measure in board games? And it in the last few years, it was difficult to say yes or no to something. So we do have a question here from Jill. Curious, I have an answer to this, I think a very simple answer, but is there any thought given to overboarding from membership on boards of non-public companies or charities?
I do recognize when I read a director biography that there are directors who have an awful lot of obligations that fall into those categories. I think my reaction is that does concern me when I see that a director has 4 or 5 of those types of things, for example, in addition to their public company work. I think what I would say is we kind of understand what it does take or should take to serve on the board of a public company, and we can sort of gauge the burden on the person's time. There's probably a far greater divergence in the time commitment to those sorts of things, those charities particularly, that it's hard. I think it's harder to say that one person's 3 charities are a bigger commitment than another person's 1.
Yeah, and I would add a very simple answer as well. Board games effectively can, a rating system can fail based on disclosure, right? It's about disclosure, and whether it's a requirement or it's voluntary. And a lot of what we're seeing that's getting rated through board games are, part of it is required, and then over time, it's become a voluntary item that's become disclosed more and more often. In this case, it's not common to see literally a list of every director's directorships, and so it's not really possible to have an objective measurement based on that as disclosure is today. We'll take one last one here. Wesley here is saying, I guess more of a comment on climate companies could just be evaluated based on the degree that they're aligned with the TCFD or perhaps even the governance component of the TCFD disclosure guidelines.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a fair comment for the fall of 2022 when we first took a spin at this. TCFD was not nearly as embraced. And in fact, I believe there's a CPA Canada report from a couple years ago that said, I think that, I don't think that they named the company, but they said they looked at a number of large TSX listed companies, and only one was fully complying with TCFD at the time. When you get into all those little subcategories of disclosure and breakouts, and and then a larger but still minority were doing anything related to TCFD. So your comment is totally appropriate for 2022. It would not have been workable just 18 months ago. And that's, I think, exactly why we're letting things settle in so that your question is even more reasonable in 12 months' time.
And so I do see another really great question. I would love to hear an answer from you, David, but I want to reserve that for the end for when we have time,
okay.
Unfortunately. So thank you, David. Very insightful, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So now we'll be moving into the second part of the webinar, beyond board games, to discuss what corporate governance challenges exist and how boards are navigating those challenges in 2022. Considering we all here in different ways advise boards and executives on various corporate governance matters, we want to have a discussion on really what is on the mind of boards, management, and shareholders. We want to discuss how boards can and do balance the needs and expectations of all other stakeholders, whether it be employees, customers, shareholders, and the planet, Earth. So Dexter, I'd like to start with you. I'm just going to. Thank you for being here today. I really appreciate it. I saw Mauro Sedali just recently published the Canadian proxy season review for 2022. A few very interesting key findings that I'd like to highlight. Activist campaigns in Canada fell sharply from 2021 to 2022, suggesting maybe there's more focus there. The win rates are higher, which is also interesting to really hear about, and not surprisingly, environment and social issues are more likely to draw the activist campaigns. Now, something also that's fairly new is similar to Say on Pay, where the shareholders have a non-binding advisory vote on the corporation's executive compensation. We're seeing the adoption of Say on Climate proposals that provides the shareholders with a voice on the company's climate transition plans, as well as climate-related disclosure. For this vote, institutional shareholders are largely looking for companies to have clear policies and action plans to manage climate risk and provide roadmaps towards their stated climate ambitions and targets. David earlier discussed how it's going to be important for board games to look at ESG and include criteria specifically on ESG moving forward. So ESG is a significant focus in 2022. Dexter, can you tell us more about shareholder engagement in 2022 and what do you foresee in 2023?
Thank you, Tony. And again, it's a pleasure to be a part of this panel. That's a lot of loaded question you have there, so I'm going to try to just take it one at a time. But I think it's fair to say that, the first part of your question was the fact that activism has decreased. There's some truth to that. I think it's a little bit misleading as well. I mean, obviously, what you're seeing now in the world of activism is that the board and management are quite more aware of how these things play out. And the truth is, when you have a proxy fight, odds are you're going to settle. And the fact is, what you're seeing of the public agitations that have gone to that level, it's basically because the settlement talks have fallen through. There are a lot of campaigns that are happening behind the scenes whereby, you know, the board and the management have come to a recognition that they both got a sour pill to swallow, so to speak, in terms of getting a settlement, but it keeps costs down, takes away from distractions, and keeps the company focused moving forward. And, you know, does not get out to the shareholder vote, where sometimes in some cases you may have a great plan, but based on the fact that this could be like a beauty contest, so to speak, or there could be situations whereby the market's not trending in the right direction and people are just voting with their emotions, you don't really get the right outcome. So ultimately, settlements are on the rise. And I think, you know, when we get in these type of situations, we definitely let our clients know the odds are that this will settle. But again, it's really, you know, how much they want to dig their heels in and what are the points of contention to move forward. Your second part, I guess, of your question was, are we seeing a little bit more of ESG related campaigns? And the answer is absolutely yes. Right now, I mean, ESG, as everyone knows, environmental, social, and governance, the G part is being played out for the last 12, 13 years. So, you know, for the most part now, a lot more focus on the social and environmental. I mean, clearly what happened in 2020, the George Floyd, clearly brought a lot of EDI, which is a part of the social component, up in the forefront. And, you know, issuers are now dealing with, you know, diversity, racial diversity, religious, gender, non-gender, all these type of things are now being put forward. And then on the environmental side, you're looking at campaigns that are being launched based on, you know, how is your shipment of livestock if you're in the food industry? You know, what is the situation whereby you are mining or an energy company, what the death rates? I mean, there are so many new things that we can focus on. And when you start seeing some of these areas starting to increase, the activists now have the wherewithal and the sensibility to do the research, to start questioning, what is the governance? What is happening here? How are we dealing with these things? The other side of the coin is really, we talk about ESG, we say all this stuff that we want in it, but the truth is, this stuff costs money. And at the end of the day, shareholders want a return on their investment, and they want to know what that's going to be. And as much as a society we push for this, which is a great thing, there is a balancing act that has to happen here. And I think a lot of management and the boards are dealing with this day to day. How do we balance our ESG concerns and where we want to go versus the end of the day, making sure we have a return on shareholder return for them in terms of their investment? And that's a huge balancing act. And I think ultimately, each issue has to look at their community that they're in and understand what is their impact and their role on the community that they are working within in terms of being able to push the agenda and make sure they address the constituents properly. So there's a lot more nuances here, and it's easy to sit there and say, like, you know, I'm sure you've seen in the press the Mobile One with the proxy fight with, you know, very small share ownership getting changes. You have what happened in Australia with the 11% shareholder getting four board members on the AGL energy company with, you know, again, focusing on ESG concerns. So you're seeing that, and it's a very good catchword right now, but I still think we have a lot more to learn and a lot more digging down in terms of what does that mean for our issuers, what does that mean for the community, and how it is that we're going to develop that over time. And as the governance has taken 10 to 12 years, ESG will do the same in terms of its development and growth. You asked me another question. I think I forgot.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm curious. I'm curious about what, you know, your thoughts on how the board and the executives communicate that these things cost money, and, you know, whether the cost matters. You know, and you know what I mean, like philosophically.
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, I sit on a public company board, and I'll tell you, it's a conversation we have all the time. We understand the importance of this, and we do believe we have an impact beyond the economic impact for our community and for our shareholders and our stakeholders. Right. And so there is that balancing act, and we definitely want to make sure we are front and center. Obviously, don't want to be maybe the leader in this thing because it continues to grow. But there is that balance, and there is sometimes it's pushback because management is being evaluated completely differently than the board. And again, the board is sort of in charge of strategy through the management, but we have to execute. And just the best case here is just to try to have a plan for the next 2 to 3 years, because especially climate change, we still don't know what's going to be required in terms of sustainability reporting and such and so forth. So as that progresses, we are just keeping our ear to the road and making sure we advise everyone what's happening on a basically nowadays weekly basis.
And are you seeing, I guess, a ramp up of sorts with respect to how now say on climate is now becoming more common, and I imagine even more common in the future, on, specifically looking at ESG and what that roadmap looks like and what those targets are looking like?
Yeah, so I mean, as we know, CN did it first last year, and then CP joined this year on the climate, the vote on climate change. And we have clients that we're talking to that are receiving those proposals as well. I think you're going to see a steady increase over the next 3 to 5 years on that. But yet we still don't know what that means. That's the problem. I mean, I think the government will be coming out with some guidelines end of this month if everything goes smoothly, and we'll see what that means. But again, it's a process.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. And it's all very interesting. The environmental and social policies can just be so highly politicized and emotional just because of how they touch different important elements of our lives. So I'm not surprised that there's a new focus for the activists. Does any one of our panelists a follow up? Does anyone?
Tony, I'd like to add to
Sure.
Dexter's comments, and I'll talk more about the executive comp side later, but I do see a lot of reluctance in terms of ESG because of the connection to value, and I think boards are still questioning like what is the value we're getting from it. But having kind of dealt with when new tax regulations come in and the whole fair share of tax debate, there is definitely, the costs are easy to see because they're short term and upfront. I think the benefits have a longer time frame. So there are more and more studies that are coming out that are looking at a longer time frame to quantify the benefits. So I think there's definitely some turn of that tide to connect the costs with the longer term value creation.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you, Dexter. I really appreciate those. It was very insightful. So I'd like now to speak with you, Elaine. We touched a bit on DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Board diversity or board composition, more generally, has been a top governance concern for probably over a decade now. I know I've really started looking at corporate governance practices in 2010, and I feel like it almost immediately became a hot topic. The focus on diversity and board composition has largely been focused on bringing more women onto the board and looking at gender on the board and leadership positions. And especially since the 2015 CSA diversity disclosure requirement, we've seen even more movement. Now we fast forward to today, where we're looking more broadly, considering people that are racially diverse, Indigenous, and people with disabilities. This, again, as David mentioned, aligned to the CBCA diversity disclosure requirement that was new for 2022. So for the longest time, it's been quite slow. It seems as though, especially with respect to gender diversity, there's been more significant change in the last 4 or 5 years, and I believe the composite index is at about 26% now, which is much higher than the 10% it may have started at in 2013. But we're still not at 50%, which effectively has been the philosophical target. So, I would like to hear your thoughts, Elaine, on what you see with how companies have navigated this important and significant evolution in policy and practice on board composition. As well, I'm curious how the pandemic may have played a role in the last few years.
A number of thoughts on that. So I think we have to keep in mind, first of all, demographic shifts because that's certainly having a play with board composition. You have the early boomers who are now in their 70s, moving, through their 70s, and are where there are age and term limits. That's sort of a little bit at play. You've also got a very large cohort coming through, sort of the middle boomers, if you will, the folks in their 60s. You've got a lot of the professional services firms who still have age limits. So, somewhere between age 58 and 62 in the professional services firms, they have to retire. So we've seen a huge number of professionals coming into play, and there's a large number of women in that cohort. So I think there's a report that's coming out from Blake's where they're seeing a significant number of women GCs getting onto boards. And I think we're seeing a lot of CPAs getting onto boards. So there is, all of those dynamics are at play and are having an effect. The other thing is on the diversity side, with diverse groups, the Black and various community groups, I would say the financial services sector has been really doing a lot for about the last 5-10 years to develop executives in those areas. And until someone's really at an executive level and really understands policy and strategy, they'll have a hard time getting onto a board. So I think the financial services firms are really leading in that. There are some other sectors that are leading in that. There are other sectors that are far behind. For instance, mining is still struggling to try to bring women on many boards. Energy sector is starting to make a progress. But I think you almost have to look sector by sector, because I don't think you can make a broad sweeping statement about that. And we are seeing a lot more boards coming to search firms and finding new sources of candidates, because they can't look to the end of the boardroom table and say, well, who do we know? And finding skilled professionals from various groups is not something that they have been very good at doing. So they turn to new sources, and there are a number of groups, professional groups, and different, community groups that we interact with to try to find new candidates, qualified candidates, and try to bring them to the fore. The other thing that we're seeing is that with the challenges and things like supply chain crises of the last year, the geopolitics that are occurring, and also cyber AI, boards are really looking for very specialized skills in some areas. So if they're looking for cyber expertise, AI, they're having to look at a younger demographic, because a retired executive is not going to be at the forefront of what's happening on the AI or cyber issues. So we are seeing younger directors, so directors in their 30s and in their 40s, starting to come to the table. The other thing that boards are really focusing on, in addition to ESG, is really the customer experience, and social issues and mission-driven issues. And that's where younger directors are particularly driven by those issues and are very well informed. And so we're seeing gradually, I would say it's gone much faster in the last 18 months for all the reasons that have been cited, that Dexter touched on and others. But the composition of boards is certainly changing. The face of boards is changing, and the expertise of boards is changing. I would say that boards have been working especially hard in the last 2 years. Most boards have been meeting at least bi-weekly through COVID to try to deal with resourcing issues, with health and safety issues, et cetera. And I think mid-year this year, boards are starting to fall back into a regular pattern of meetings, and starting to step back where they've really had to step in over the last 2 years and really provide a lot of support to overextended management teams. They're now starting to step back. And so we're seeing that at play as well. I think David touched on CEOs and what's happening with boards allowing CEOs to serve on outside boards. We're really seeing fairly consistently that certainly when the CEO is going into a new role, in that very first year, the boards are really saying, we really want you to concentrate on this job and what you're doing here. You know, if we allow you, it'll be a one board, external board, and usually that would be at the end of the first year once things have stabilized and settled in. And those conditions are being written into executive contracts. We're also seeing boards paying a lot more attention to attendance and the overboarding. We had one client last year where the chair of the board said anything more than 3 boards, including this one, is overboarding. So I think it depends on the size of the board, the complexity of the board. I think it depends on what's going on in the board. If there's M&A activity going on, if someone is chairing the audit committee, you know, I think those are the kinds of things you need to look at when you're looking at overboarding. So it's what's the nature of the work. But I would say that all boards are working harder, are spending more time preparing for their board meetings. And boards are also looking amongst candidates for, are candidates staying current with the evolution of governance? So are they staying on top of legislation? They don't have to necessarily have a designation, but they certainly need to be staying on top of governance best practices. So however they do that, and they're expecting that their board directors will do that on their own time, in addition to greatly increased board education. And in fact, what some boards are doing, we're seeing this. In fact, I was speaking to someone just the other day, a client, where they are either looking for people who have ICD, or else they will pay for the ICD or certified director program for their new directors, because they're looking for that competency and that expertise. So we're seeing that. In terms of DEI, I think boards are making room for, and actually let me backtrack. Boards are dealing with strategy now at every board meeting. Once upon a time, they used to do an annual strategy session, usually in the fall, kick off the year. Strategy is now a point of discussion on virtually every board agenda, whether it's just a touch point, how are we doing? Are we on track, off track? Or you know, you have some geopolitical issue, a supply chain issue that's drastically impacting your strategy. And so you're relooking that and having a thorough discussion on that. Strategy is also driving executive appointments, making sure that if the strategy has changed, market conditions have changed, have we got the right CEO, have we got the right senior team? So there's a lot of that at play, but that's also driving board recruitment. So a lot of boards are saying, you know what, the kind of skills we had a year or 2 ago are not the skills we need going forward. We need to change it up. So what's happening is they are either increasing the number of board directors on a temporary basis to bring on additional skill sets that are needed. And then as people's terms run out, they'll go back to the regular number of board directors. Or they will ask directors who are perhaps not performing or to step off to create space for new skills, new competencies, and to achieve diversity. So I think that's also happening. I think we need to be realistic about that. So I think those are some of the key things we're seeing. But the other thing we're also seeing is that boards are paying much more attention to board evaluation. focusing on board performance. And that's where they're looking at attendance, they're looking at engagement, and they're also increasingly looking for outside support to do that board evaluation. I mean, that's something that's been in place in Europe and in the UK for a number of years, where every year you have to do a formal board evaluation report on it. And then every third year, you need to have an outside party conduct that and report on it. So we're certainly not there, but certainly boards are paying much more attention to evaluating their own performance and individual director performance. So I think I'm going to stop there.
All right. Well, thank you for that. It's very insightful. So clearly the work of the board is shifting, and so too is who sits on it effectively.
Yeah. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to jump in on that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
in the interest
if
of
I may.
time. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was going to say,
Go
Elaine, I echo all of what you stated there. I guess the question I wanted to ask you, something I've witnessed in our job, is the word qualified always boggles my mind to an extent, because you know, I think there is many qualified people that can be on boards that fit many categories, and as we know, but I find it very interesting in my experience. A lot of board members or boards itself will state, well, this person has the requirements, but they do not have the experience. And, you know, to which I have to remind them, when you got your first board position, you did not have the experience either. So it seems that as we get older, maybe we forget where we came from. But do you have to deal with that issue as well, in terms of just reminding folks that qualification is great, but experience, you can take the ICD course and all that other things. That's not enough sometimes. So sometimes you have to recognize you're going to have to, train as you go. And are they willing to take that on?
I think some boards are. I think some boards are being very realistic about that. And so, for instance, if they're trying to add a cyber expert or an AI expert, I'll say you're not going to get a 65-year-old AI expert because it's an emerging field. A lot of what's coming to the fore and the leaders in AI are probably younger directors who have no board experience. They may not even be at a C-suite level. They may be a senior professional or a junior executive. But if you feel you need to have that expertise, then as you bring that person on board, how are you going to mentor them? Who's going to sponsor them? What's going to be the board education? And how are you going to enable them to succeed? And really, how are you going to get the best from that individual? And how, so it's a conversation I have often. And it depends on the board. So I also say to someone who's a newly minted director who's just retired, you're not going to get on the Royal Bank board. So, you have a journey, and try to get experience across different sectors. And you may get to the Royal Bank, but it's not going to be in the first year. So, so I think it's an education both with candidates and with companies.
Perfect. Thank you.
And I would add, in my study and in my discussion, it's the evergreen challenges have been onboarding, right? How to effectively onboard. A lot of new directors don't feel properly onboarded, probably for a few years, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And we actually asked one very specific question a couple times in surveying directors, and while a requirement for board for becoming a director was prior board experience, a follow-up question to what was valuable, what this person brought as what was valuable to inside the boardroom, board experience is actually at the bottom, right? So, right, we're looking at effectively a hard skill that directors ultimately, if the person is brought in and they're highly effective, they don't see that it was their prior board experience that's been making them highly effective in their role, right? So it's a very interesting conversation to have, especially as the boards want, or our, you know, stakeholders are looking for a more diverse board and less homogeneous boards.
Mhm. I think the other thing we're seeing is when companies are trying to understand the consumer, the customer experience, and increasingly that customer is a millennial or is a younger person, trying to get that voice and getting inside their head and their, you know, what is important to them and mission, you know, for employees, mission driven social purpose is really key. So trying to bring that voice to the board table is also really important.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, definitely. I agree. So Michael, I'd like to bring you into the conversation now. You know, we've now heard from David, Dexter, Elaine on a spectrum of governance challenges and shareholder expectations. The governance of environment and social issues is top of mind and are more likely today to be the reason for an activist campaign. In your experience, what are the challenges that boards grapple with where meeting regulatory requirements ends and shareholder expectations begin? I guess for lack of a better question, what is keeping a corporate director up at night?
Well, thanks for having me. And I know there are a lot of lawyers on the line, so a lot of what I'm saying, I'm about to say, you probably know already. I think my sense of for a lot of directors is that they're feeling somewhat bombarded. Is that you've got these expectations in the marketplace about, you know, enhanced disclosure about various issues such as ESG, board diversity, climate change. And there is some codification occurring of the disclosure requirements. Like, for example, in the climate change area, you have proposed National Instrument 51107, disclosure of climate-related matters. There's proposed SEC rules. The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions has got some proposed disclosure, and plus there's the International Sustainability Standards Board. So we have got sort of moving targets in terms of what the company's disclosure should look like. And then also, as the Canadian Securities Administrators recently published a notice saying that there isn't a consistency in terms of the approach of these various codes of disclosure, and in terms of the specifics, and they're going to try and, you know, do what they can to harmonize things. I guess in the case of the SEC rules, I suspect that what the Canadians have to say about their rules isn't going to be very relevant. So I think it's a challenge for these directors. I think in the past, and when you've had earlier concepts of corporate social responsibility or social license, there was a tendency for a lot of companies to, you know, check the box, have a check the box mentality, and to use boilerplate disclosure. Securities regulators for a number of years now in both Canada and the United States have pushed back strenuously against that sort of approach. And as you've probably seen in the financial press more recently, the SEC is going quite vigorously after companies or investment funds that are what they call greenwashing. I think also the size, I think the makeup of the business community in Canada, I think also is a factor, in that we do have, you know, very large global companies that are based in Canada, but we also have a mid-tier and a junior tier of companies, some of them which are quite small. And so in terms of the amount of attention that the board pays to these issues, you know, these issues of ESG, board diversity, et cetera, is partly influenced by the size of the company. Like, I expect in a lot of the big companies, very large companies, they probably have one or more people in senior management who are actually dedicated to those issues and assisting in terms of, you know, what are the current standards of disclosure and actually practice. I mean, what are people doing there? Where you're going to have other companies where you've got, you say, a general counsel will be tasked with that. And I don't have to tell all the general counsel on the phone, you've got a lot on your plate. So that makes it a challenge. And then you have a lot of companies in Canada that don't have a general counsel. I think those are all factors. But it's clear that, you know, the directors are reading the financial press, you know, the discussion about these issues. You have institutional investors such as BlackRock, which is, you know, sort of at the forefront of pushing on the ESG issue. You know, the proxy advisory firms like Glass Lewis and ISS. So there's an increasing pressure. So I suspect what you're going to see is that either enthusiastically or grudgingly, I think you're going to see more and more directors paying attention to this. As an example of how it's taken in the case of ESG, I read one report that for the 2022 proxy season in Canada, 75% of the TSX 60 companies have formally incorporated ESG into their compensation plans or have disclosed the intention to doing that. So I would say, now one of the big issues for directors, and I think, you know, other participants in the marketplace is, you know, what exactly does the E, the S, and the G mean in the context of a particular company? You know, what are the metrics? I mean, first off, you know, there's a disclosure of what you're doing, but in terms of grading yourself, and I think this, David, this came up earlier, you know, there isn't a uniform set of metrics out there that you can use to judge a company on each of those issues. And so you're going to have this external codification occur by regulators or market participants. But I think internally boards are going to, are I think, grappling with that issue as to how do they judge themselves. You know, some of the standards will be easy to determine whether they're in compliance. Some of them are going to be more difficult. And as I mentioned, in terms of, you know, what type of company you are, like I expect that for a consumer-facing company, it may have different priorities than for a company, say, in the mining sector, which is not consumer-facing. It's the relative importance of its stakeholders is going to vary from company to company. So that's why, for example, I do a lot in the mining sector. You know, issues like environmental and social, or is it, I guess, used to be called corporate social responsibility, it tended to be high on the radar for a number of years. I think the governance side, not as much. Whereas companies in other sectors, the G has probably been important for quite a while. So I think overall, I think there's an increasing number of directors that are paying attention to this issue. But as I say, it can be a little bit baffling and overwhelming.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, you know, I think this dovetails really nicely, actually, into more specifically what Emma will be touching on ESG and CEO comp, CEO comp design. And, you know, the external codification still feels a bit like a Wild West, right? Which framework do you want to use? Which one's appropriate? What are our shareholders expecting from us? You know, there still feels like there are a lot of questions, and you can effectively see that also in the disclosure of how it's disclosed in the proxies specifically. So thank you for that, Michael.
Thank you.
So now, Emma, thank you for being here and waiting here with us today. We've had several discussions about ESG and compensation design, among other things, since you joined GGA as well, and how companies and specifically boards oversee and discuss the ESG agenda is important to you and is certainly a focus of yours. Lately, you've spent quite a bit of time looking into ESG and CEO pay in the last few months. What have you found, and what are your thoughts on the progress in the last few years on this matter?
Well, the direction of travel of ESG is pretty clear. It is only increasing. There is lots of pressure from various stakeholders on companies. You know, Larry Fink being, you know, prominent figure on this. I think today in the news, Bluebell Capital wants him to resign because he's a hypocrite. So there's all kinds of noise and pressure and lots of things for companies to navigate. In my interest, from a board perspective, I mean, there's the broader question of ESG and what is that, you know, what's the role of the board in overseeing ESG? I zeroed in on executive compensation because I found it interesting that of the largest companies, Michael mentioned, TSX, 75% have incorporated ESG metrics in their compensation. I think globally that number is about 60%, with Europe sort of leading the charge. But it caused me to question, the companies that haven't, the 25 to 40%. Why have they not incorporated it into their executive comp? What's the message that they're sending to their investors and their stakeholders, their employees? Are they not holding executives accountable? So I really wanted to dig into that and understand better those ones that are disclosing it. Are there some best practices evolving? What kinds of things are they doing? And the ones that are not doing anything, I mean, what are the challenges that they're facing? And I'll give you the punchline early in case anybody's dropping off. My view is, from looking at this research and the pressures in the market and stakeholder interest, activist investors, if a company has an ESG strategy, they absolutely need to incorporate it in their executive compensation. They can take incremental steps to do it, or they can take bold steps to do it, but they need to do it because the message that it's sending and the gap that they're leaving out there in the market, I think, to stakeholders is the risk is too high. So let me backtrack a little bit. It's interesting. We've heard a lot about different regulators and different things. We are converging, I think, on consistent regulations coming very soon in 2023 through the efforts of ISSB and the SEC, and they're all kind of converging on TCFD. So I think the somewhat excuse of we don't have consistent regulations is quickly becoming outdated, because there's absolutely convergence across the globe. And then I did find it interesting that when you look at the ESG as an initiative from a regulatory perspective, and then the spotlight on executive comp, so say on pay, the new pay versus performance in the US, there's lots of pressure and momentum on both of those. But the link between the two is not necessarily very strong. So on the pay versus performance, although there's a recognition that non-financial measures can be included, why didn't they say at least one ESG metric? I think that connection between the ESG regulations moving forward very quickly and the spotlight on executive comp, which has been there for a long time, and how it connects to ESG could definitely be stronger. And so the practices are somewhat lagging. There's lots of examples of activist investors who are becoming increasingly successful in challenging executive comp when it does not include ESG metrics. And, even before 2020, inclusion of ESG metrics in executive comp really wasn't tracked very well. So I would say this is an area that's receiving significant focus in very recent years. So I also looked at, and this was through looking at companies and sitting on some webinars for director conferences in Europe, just to understand the differences between Europe and North America. So there's definitely practices out there, and there are some leading practices that are emerging. However, North America, the portion of ESG metrics in executive comp is about 5 to 10%. And if you kind of look at that, you have to question whether that's really significant and whether that's really going to drive, the necessary changes that ESG is going to require. In Europe, in contrast, that percentage is closer to 25 to 30%. Now, that is significant in executive comp. So it's clear that having ESG metrics in your executive comp is driving the behavior, and definitely, it's definitely driving change. I think, coming back to North America, the companies that are including ESG metrics in their compensation, some are some are doing it well, but even in the universe of 60 to 75%, the practice is not very well evolved. So still a lot of focus on S metrics as opposed to E metrics. Still somewhat of a check the box type of an approach. They could also be cherry picking, it's still not very clear, not very transparent, so that they can pick and choose, cherry pick what gets grouped under ESG in terms of remunerating the executive. So I think there's still a lot of practices where, the executive payouts are happening, but maybe not necessarily tied to change and progress. Now, on the other side, I think where best practices are, and there's no question there's lots of challenges. We still don't have the regulations, so although they're converging, they're still, not final, other than Europe is moving ahead with CSRD. The data is still lacking until we have the regulations and it's embedded in the enclosure. So reliable and measurable data is still a challenge. And some companies still are struggling and boards are struggling with what's that link to performance. So, those things are still holding companies back. And then the more recent kind of escalation of greenwashing accusations are definitely making companies pull back and looking at, okay, what are we really saying? And can we really support what we're saying in terms of the metrics and targets with real evidence? So best practices are evolving, and I would just say, I know we're running out of time. I would say those best practices that I have found are the ones that are really looking at how do we measure progress? How are we measuring progress on ESG? How are we making progress? An example would be looking at, rating scores, not in one agency, but across a number of different agencies, and looking to see how do we compare in terms of our peer group, in terms of our industry. Are we making progress relative to that? And then also how quickly are we making that progress? So that speed of change is also another element. And so companies are becoming much more transparent and much more detailed in terms of the metrics that they're using. So I would say, given this kind of heated environment, it's definitely better to be prepared rather than be forced by a shareholder proposal to have to address this issue, because it is by no way simple, like everything else.
Right. And you may have aspirational targets or actual hard targets for the future, but use your roadmap, for instance, to measure and include in the CEO pay design, for instance.
You're much better off presenting at least a roadmap and saying, here's where we're starting. Right. Here's some of the other things we'll anticipate bringing in later years. But I think in this case, silence is not golden.
Right. So thank you for that, Emma. I think now we are definitely tight for time, but we'll take some questions. So there is a Q&A bubble up top on the toolbar in MS Teams if you're unsure of how to ask questions. We do have a question here. What does board member performance mean? Does attendance really imply performance? That seems like a pretty low bar. I would agree. Does anyone have a very specific answer to this that they'd like to give?
I think attendance is not the driving factor there, but I think it is engagement. Stepping up, being prepared, engaging in discussion, using your expertise in an appropriate way. A lot of focus on board culture these days, increasingly. So board setting the tone for the culture and reflecting the culture of the organization. So I think it's all of those things. If you look at boards that have best practice, how does the board support, challenge, interact with the senior team? How informed are they? Can they lead a discussion, really contribute in a significant way? I think those are all of the aspects. Has the board, and board evaluation is a number of things. It's evaluating the overall performance of the board and how they've led an organization and supported an organization, to individual director performance. chair performance is how are they able to really support and further the strategy of the organization through their committee leadership, their board leadership. How have they been able to structure the board, and just general board leadership and engagement, I think. And you can break it down more finely than that, but I think that those are key contributing factors. And anybody can add to that.
Thank you. Just very quickly, David, I'm not sure if you'd like to take a stab at, can you advise when the board game results are expected to be published this year? Is that possible to be disclosed? Oh, you're on mute, David.
Sorry about that. Our hope
Just
is
very
to
quickly.
have that within about, what's today, the 7th? Less than 2 weeks.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I apologize. We just don't have the time to get to all of the questions here today. I'd just like to say in closing that all of us at Global Governance Advisors would like to thank Mauro Sedali, Canada, our strategic partners, for their cooperation in setting up this webinar. Dexter, you and your team were incredibly great to work with in setting up the webinar. It was a pleasure. The Globe and Mail with David Milstead for joining us to discuss and provide an inside perspective on board games and its future. And to our other great panelists, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you for sharing your experience and insights with us today. You provided the context of the complexity and challenges behind the scores in board games. So thank you for your time, everyone. And we will be sharing a recording of this session with you all in due time. So thank you all. Take care.
Thank you very much. Our pleasure.